And we know how prevalent it is, not only here in East Tennessee, but throughout the state as well as the country. And we're fortunate in that just a few years ago, a new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was started in Washington, D.C., Office for Older Americans Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And we're lucky to be able to have the Deputy Assistant Director, Michael Herndon, come from there. And he's from around here. He ain't from here, but this guy is from here. If you look, Michael is from the University of Tennessee, has his Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and Master of Public Administration from Georgia State University, and he has a lot of vast knowledge of this very important issue. So let's welcome Michael Herndon.
I have to start off with a disclaimer, a very long, dry federal government disclaimer that basically I'll paraphrase and say, it says that the views expressed today are my own and not those of the Bureau. I may get something wrong, and as well that in my presentation I'm going to be talking about some resources that we've not vetted. I think that they are very credible resources once you see who are the authors of them, but those are not necessarily vetted by my agency. So as I said, I'm very glad to be here today. When the invitation came out to our office, I said, I'll take that one. Obviously, being a volunteer, and my mom lives in Tellico Village, all the rest of my family's in Nashville, so this means a lot to me to be here, not just because of helping you, but my family's here. I have my mother, 79 years old, living out in Tellico Village by herself, and I think about Onabel every day, whether or not somebody's going to try to take advantage of her, and working with her bank to tell them, if you see anything that is going on, you need to call me. So this is an incredibly powerful event for me to be at here in East Tennessee. You can go to the next slide. So as Don said, I work for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It was created, you can go to the next slide, make sure. It was created we opened the doors in 2011. It was created after the financial crisis. And a number of regulatory efforts or regulatory responsibilities came to us. And so we work to regulate a portion of financial products in the markets. And we do that in order to empower or to help consumers and the market itself and then the responsible providers in that. So if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to lay out a bit of kind of how we do that. And we say this very broadly in that we empower people. And that really comes through that you can complain to say, I'm having a problem with this particular loan servicer or a particular mortgage product. There's something going on here, and we give a place for people to report that into us. And we work with financial institutions to resolve those problems. We make that data public as well to say, here are trends that we are seeing. There's a lot of things going on, like we're seeing a lot of complaints about reverse mortgages, or we're seeing a lot of other issues, and that helps us, and it helps society as a whole to understand complaint and certain trends within financial products. We also enforce. We have rules that we create, and we have an enforcement arm. And where I come in, where my office comes in, is a division that's education. It's the Consumer Education and Engagement Division. And if you can go to the next slide. And within that division, we have an office for older Americans. Now, within that division, we actually have an office, special population offices. It was mandated by law in the Dodd-Frank law that we have these offices, one for service members to help them with particular issues that are very unique to them. We have one for students and youth. We have one for what we call empowerment, which means economically vulnerable and the lowest income people in the United States, what we can do to help them. And then as well, we have the Office for Older Americans. And what we do in that office is sort of two different things. One is sort of the direct-to-consumer kinds of information that we can put out. It may be something like understanding how to choose a financial advisor. We have an online tool that helps people understand the impact of claiming Social Security at 62 versus their full retirement age, which they rarely know what that means, which is going to, for most people, going to starting approaching 67 and up to 70. What does the impact of me claiming along there? So we have a tool that helps them do that. And then we do another sort of segment of work, which is really what brings me here today, which is we have helping to people to working with intermediaries and working what we can do to affect the environment in that people work. And I'm going to, because the slides are behind me, take this off so I can turn a little bit easier and face the slides and see where I am in my presentation. So we worked in preventing deceptive and abusive practices targeted at older people. So we have guides that we put out for financial institutions and explanations on research around what can help the system in which people operate. So that's one of the reasons that we're here today is we've put together some, if you can go to the next slide, information around financial institutions. And this graph here I pulled from the Census Bureau, and what I wanted to do here was just to sort of show you the scale of what the issue is in sort of a visual. And I'm sorry that the numbers are hard to read, but you can at least see the bars. The blue bars are the millions of people who are age 65 plus in the United States. And it goes all the way back to 1900. And it goes forward to about, I think, 2050. And you can see over time, we know longevity, population in the country is growing, there's more older people. The red line is the percent of people in the United States who are over 65, the percent of the population. And you can see over time, since 1900, it went up, leveled off a little bit, and this is due to the baby boom coming in, and there at that time were larger numbers and created it. And what I want to point out to you very specifically is the huge spike. That starts in 2010, and it goes from around 12% up to over 20% in a matter of 20 years. And we're in the midst of that right now. This is 2017. It started in 2010, and it's going to go on until 2030. So as you can tell, we are in an unprecedented spike in aging in this country right now. And that has all kinds of implications for financial services and how they deliver and what's the issues that they face, and for social services and law enforcement. Never before have we seen such a high percentage of our population who are older. And if you can go to the next slide. And where that aging is occurring, and this one's a little bit maybe harder to see, the bottom colored piece, and this is just, again, millions of people who are over the age of 62. My office, by law, we address people at age 62, so that's where we pulled this data. People who are in their 60s, the millions of people that's on the bottom, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 100s. 100 plus is coming in there. And what I also want to point out to you is, look actually that the number of people in the 60s and 70s, as we go through the years, is actually a dip. And that's my generation, Gen X. We're so small compared to the millennials and the baby boom that we actually are a little bit smaller. The number of people who are 60s and 70s is going to go down. Where aging is coming is in the 80s, 90s, and 100 plus. So again, what we're looking at is an unprecedented growth in the number of people who are older in this country, and where that aging is occurring is in the highest ranges. You can go to the next slide. So that sort of sets the context of the size of the issue and what we're seeing. So again, for financial institutions, I wanted to point out in this slide a little bit about, which is I guess what we kind of assume, is that older people tend to use online and mobile technologies less so than younger people. So you can see here, and this was from 2013, an FDIC study, typical. Older people go to the teller, less likely to use an ATM, all the way down to mobile banking. And again, this is for 65 plus. So probably, again, those who are in the 80s and where the population is growing, where we're seeing that growth, is probably going to be even less. And this tracks a lot of what you would see in technology adoption in anything, not just in financial services, but any kinds of communication, which may have an implication for other kinds of delivery of social services and communications. If you think, well, we'll just create an app. Okay, who are you going to service with that? How are you going to address things? Websites, all of those things. So if you can go to the next slide. And where that sort of intersects is with some of the things that we know about cognitive issues. Now, and I used to work at AARP, and so I know from that time, it's very much in the messaging of aging is a positive thing. It's great that we are all able to age. And that aging doesn't mean that you will have these things happen to you. The prevalence of these things are more likely to be among this population. So just because somebody's 85 doesn't mean they have dementia. It means that more people who are 85 plus might have dementia. So in these things about cognitive status here, you can see that about 22% of the 69 plus have mild cognitive impairment. The Alzheimer's Association did some research and said point out 33% of people 84 plus are likely to have Alzheimer's. So again, think back to where are we seeing the population growth? It's in the oldest of the old that's growing. What do they not do? They go to the banks. They actually use ATMs. They are accustomed to having these relationships with people. So this sort of is a perfect marriage to say that banks are a great opportunity, financial institutions, and not just banks and credit unions, but others, accountants, investment, insurance agents, people who have these long-term relationships are able to provide, I think, a front line of defense. They're often the very first people that see a problem. And then this is going to be on how they can utilize the resources that are out there and what they can do to address this problem. So if we can go to the next slide. So the problem of financial elder financial exploitation, obviously we've talked about throughout the day. What is it? It's an improper use of assets, property, funds, those kinds of things. It is the most common form of elder abuse. There are other forms we've talked, you've heard about, like physical abuse, sexual abuse. There's other kinds of abuse that happens among elders and that they're particularly vulnerable to, but this is the one that happens the most often. They're targeted because of, obviously, that's where the money is. Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. And I would also say that don't necessarily think that a perpetrator is targeting older people. They might say this is a great way to go get the money. It may be just that's who's falling for it. Investment fraud. I used to work in investment fraud prevention, and people would talk about having investment fraud for high school students, and it's like, well, they're not going to fall for it because they don't have any investments. Investment and fraud occurs among people who have investments. So financial fraud is going to probably occur among people who have some sort of financial resources, a monthly check, property, household goods, jewelry, bank accounts, those kinds of things. So perpetrators won't necessarily always think I am targeting older people. It may be just that's who is the pool that they have to go after. The prevalence, it varies. Some of the work I've done in the past, we've talked to healthcare officials about how they've done particular outreach around prevention. Healthcare is very locked down. They can tell you how many cases of melanoma were diagnosed in the United States last year. When it comes to fraud, we kind of guess. We sort of think, well, there's different types of fraud. We don't really know. We don't know necessarily the amounts lost and the number of people. And you can see here the range. One study says 2.9 billion, one says 36. We know that it's billions. We know that it happens among hundreds of thousands, millions of people, but really it's much harder for us in this sort of community to know the prevalence, other than we know once is too much, it's awful, but we could, there's probably hope to even do even better in the future. And another problem that we see within the elder financial exploitation is that the underreporting. If somebody breaks into your house and steals your TV, you're mad about it. And you go to the police and you tell them, somebody broke in and took my TV. But what if it's something that you feel like you were involved in? Now, maybe if you left the door unlocked, you said, okay, I was involved. Elder financial exploitation, a lot of financial crimes, people certainly feel like embarrassed about it. As you get older, you may feel, well, if I bring this forward, am I going to lose independence and control over my own life? So there's a lot of reasons why the underreporting, and they may not even realize they've been defrauded or that they have been abused and the money's been taken from it. So the underreporting is also a very large problem within the whole issue of elder financial abuse and exploitation. If you can move to the next slide. So CFPB, to help with this, and I'm going to provide you the highlights today, the report that I'm going to reference, and I've got a few more copies at our table in the back. It's quite, we've done a very extensive report. There's a lot of recommendations and a lot of detail in that report. So I'm just going to give you the highlights today and let you look at the report and download it later. So if you can move on, I'm sorry. So we created a report and recommendations that helps financial institutions understand what they can do to help identify and protect and certainly make bring forward any instances that they are aware of elder financial exploitation. What I will highlight here the most is that the advisory does not impose any responsibilities or duties on financial institutions. This is not rulemaking. This is, again, from an office that's trying to help within the environment that people work in their financial lives. So we're putting out suggested practices. What are things that banks could do? What are some examples of other good practices that we've uncovered? So that's kind of one of the things I really want to highlight within all of this material. If you can move to the next slide. So the recommendations that we've put forward here, I also will sort of note that we understand that there are great differences between financial institutions. Size, a credit union and what they do, it could be very small. It could be a statewide chartered bank. It could be particular, markets that they serve. Certainly where my mom lives, out in Tellico Village, there's a particular, what they're going to experience in Tellico Village versus what they are down on the Strip. So, we recognize that institutions and the markets they serve are going to be very different. If you can move to the next slide. So the overview of the recommendations, and again, in that guide and the materials that you can either pick up or download, we start off with, we say, or, the protocols. And this is kind of your game plan. This is sort of the overall policies and procedures that a financial institution could put together to address various topics around elder financial exploitation. It's going to go through a number of things that you can do, and that's sort of the protocol would help sort of set up the overall framework, and then each of these that I'm going to walk you through are the individual pieces. So the first one, if you can go to the next slide, is about training. So obviously, the staff who are going to be encountering this in a particular location are going to need to know a little bit about what is financial exploitation. What are some of the signs that I might see? And it's going to vary, of course, according to what staff person you're dealing with. The tellers might need to know very specific instances of if I see if I see somebody who's physically in danger, what do I do? That's not a financial issue. That's a law enforcement issue. Somebody's got them grabbed by the arm. I see a physical issue. That's not part of being a teller, so they might need to be very specifically trained. These are the steps: adult protective services, escalate, call law enforcement, versus somebody who's in a supervisory role in the back office. They're not likely to think about, I'm going to be encountering physical issues, but I might need to know about data and kinds of transactions and what should we be looking for in that sort of sense. So we're very cognizant, and in the reports and in the advisory, it goes into great detail about the differences of what you could do. Tellers, again, they might be trained on just the prompts and responses. You may give them very specific lines to repeat. If somebody comes in and they think a transaction is particularly suspicious, what is the line? What are the words you want that teller to say? Mrs. So-and-so, I would like to speak to you over here. Mrs. So-and-so, I noticed that for the first time you have taken out X amounts of dollars in cash, and you've never done that before. What can they say? What can they not say? Kind of getting into that. They may need to know very specifically those kinds of words. If you can move to the next slide. Another thing that the protocols could lay out for you is the detection. What kinds of detection? Now, obviously a teller and having that frontline staff is one method, but another piece that we go through in the report is about using technology. What kinds of systems do you have in place to monitor suspicious activities? Those can be utilized to help identify and report cases of elder financial exploitation. There's an example I've heard of before where in the United Kingdom, a bank simply pulled a public database of entities that a regulator was putting out there that said, we have reason to believe these companies are fraudulent. These companies have said they are registered with us, and these are different financial regulators there, but they're not. These companies are lying. These are fraudulent entities. They simply took that database and put it into their system so that when anyone ever went to transfer money and the name of that company came up, they put in an alert, either online or in person, to say, the financial regulator says that this company, they have reason to believe this company is fraudulent. And do you want to proceed? And of course people said, no, I don't want to proceed with this. And they've saved millions of pounds of money in fraud. So those are the kinds of technology systems or technology opportunities that we see that could possibly address this. And one of the other points that I'll highlight here is that there are indications of elder financial exploitation certainly may not match with what you see otherwise in financial institutions. For example, frequent change of address. For somebody, that may actually be a sign that you're changing your address, or frequently, or there's other types of things. And in the report, they go into great detail about things that might be able to be altered to indicate that it's actually something that might be an indication of elder financial exploitation. Can we go to the next slide? So some of the other elements are the reporting. What kinds of steps do they need to have? What's the escalation that you need to have to report this out? And certainly we encourage financial institutions to report all cases of this. Be aware, certainly, now, and I didn't, if I'd been really good, I would have taken the time to understand exactly what the reporting requirements are here in Tennessee. I know that they vary state by state, and some financial institutions are going to have to deal with, depending on how big they are, the different state law and mandates of reporting. And also, if you're not familiar with the term SARS, Suspicious Activity Report, that's a great tool for financial institutions to report. We've just released a memo that I'll talk about a little bit later that actually adds some more detail about the use of SARS to help identify cases of elder financial exploitation. It's certainly something that we as an agency believe has a great power to help both law enforcement and adult protective services and a lot of people in the community understand the cases, both the numbers that are coming out and then the narratives that are written in those reports. One of the issues that certainly has come up from time to time is banks and other financial institutions saying, well, there's some privacy rules and I'm not quite sure what our obligations are under privacy rules. So CFPB, a number of years ago, I think it was 2013, worked with other federal financial regulators to say, here, the Graham-Leach-Bliley, which is a particular law that dealt with financial privacy, said you couldn't share that information. Banks can't share that information. We wanted to make sure that that financial institutions understand that reporting elder financial exploitation is not violating privacy. You reporting it to the police and adult protective services and whatever you need to do, generally you're going to be okay. There's plenty of safe harbors, there's guidance, there's encouragement there to report that. It's not something that financial institutions generally need to feel concerned about. And lastly, I'd also like to say, understand the role of the first responders. Often, financial institutions have no idea what adult protective services do. But they have no idea what the long-term care ombudsman does. They don't really understand how law enforcement can be involved. So understand the way that those first responders can be involved and what they can do and cannot do for you. What are the obligations of each? There's some information a little bit further on that I'll talk about where we explain ways that can happen. If we'll move to the next slide. And protecting older account holders is sort of the things that a financial institution can do within those sort of account offerings that could help prevent and at least detect, if not prevent, elder financial exploitation. So Regulation E in the Electronic Funds Transfer Act, we had talked about that complaint process and that we were able to analyze complaints. One of the things we saw were a lot of older people were reporting that they had problems with, they were saying that money has been illegally transferred in my account. And there's some regulations and rules about what banks have to do for that consumer under Regulation E. So that's one of the things that we've got some, again, separate guidance on to help people comply with those regulations, but that's certainly very important. One of the ideas that we've come up with, or one of the things that we think is good and a lot of financial institutions can do, is have a third-party designee. So the BB&T out in Tellico Village knows that if something looks suspicious, they can call me when Onabel comes in. That they know that. So we've taken that proactive step to make sure that if something comes along, it could happen, or that they could contact me and I can investigate the matter. And that's an opportunity. There's ways that financial institutions can do that. There's also other types of age-friendly product offerings, like we like to call it, that can be implemented. Planning for incapacity. Talking to someone in advance about what do you want to be happen in the future, and certainly try to put it in aspirational tones You don't want to say what do you want to have happen when when you begin to decline, but talk about what do you want your legacy to be. What do you want? What can we do to help you make sure that your money and your estate and everything is sort of managed the way you want it to be. Honoring powers of attorney, opt-in account features like limits. If somebody could say, I don't travel anymore. I don't have a car, I don't travel. If you start seeing transactions and ATM transactions going on in another state, I want to be alerted to that. Right now, ATM transactions may not be an issue that a bank or a financial institution red flags. But if somebody comes in and says, I'm here now, that's certainly something that could help. If you could move to the next slide. And the last thing within these protocols is collaboration. And it's certainly something that we think is very powerful because, again, it helps a financial institution understand what APS does. It helps APS understand what information they can provide. It could help law enforcement. So that collaboration certainly is an opportunity for cross-education, but also case resolution. And one of the things, if you can move on to the next slide. So this is where all of that entire report can be provided. And I will say that after the FI and after the report, it's underscores. It doesn't show up well here, but those are underscore after FI underscore report underscore elder abuse. So if you can move on to the next slide. So one of the memos that we put out, I mentioned earlier, it's about the use of SARS and how financial institutions and law enforcement and adult protective services can utilize that information. It came out in August of this year, a joint memo by my agency, Treasury, and then a bureau within Treasury called FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And it's just providing more clarity about the use of those forms, how they can be utilized, and what each of those three areas can do with them. We are going to be providing some webinars on the use of these. So if you have any interest in the webinars about SARS reporting, SARS the data gathering, and how each entity can utilize those, we'll be having some webinars later on. Stop by our area back there and take my card, or I'll do my best to try to get the information to you about when those webinars are happening. You want to move to the next slide? And as I had mentioned, the privacy concerns, the guidance from my agency came out in 2013. It's among other federal financial regulators, the SEC, FDIC, anyone that was a particular law that we all are under, that they said any of these agencies will get together. And it provides just the greatest clarity that you can around what people can share and what they cannot under those privacy concerns. You can move to the next slide. So when it comes to collaboration, one of the things that we've been doing is some pilot efforts. And we've been going into particular local communities to help them facilitate setting up protective networks. And these networks, there's a number of them across the country. And it's much like what East Tennessee Elder Watch does, bring together the stakeholders to prevent elder financial exploitation. Whether it be in one community, there may be more about law enforcement, or maybe more about adult protective and other kinds of social services. Some places it may be more about financial institutions. But those networks exist in a variety of models around the country. So we did a report to understand, how did they get going? How many are there, and what's the type of structure that they have, and what do they do, and what are they accomplishing? So we came out with a report and a guide to help people set up networks or to operate networks. And one of the things that we've been doing is some pilot efforts to help communities begin those networks where they don't exist. So we've done it in Gainesville, Florida, Muskogee, Oklahoma, and next week we're doing one in Crossville, Tennessee. And once the invitation for this came through, I began working with Kimberly Bohannon from the Knoxville TVA Employees Credit Union and said, we have an interest in this sort of setting up these networks. And obviously Cumberland County, high percentage of older people because of Fairfield Glade and the other place there, I forget the name. And we actually realized they had a network. So what we're doing, we spoke to Linnell Godsey there, who's heads up that abuse prevention network. We said, well, how can we work with you? And she said, this is great timing. We've been wanting to expand and add on to the impact of our work. So we're going to be doing a convening next week of stakeholders in Cumberland County and in Crossville for Cumberland County and the surrounding region. So if anyone, again, direct you to my table, if you have an interest in attending that event, let me know, and there's some information about it back at our table. If you can move to the next slide. Another thing that within the sort of, I think financial institutions are often eager to do is involved in consumer education. So we've worked with the FDIC to create a Money Smart program. The FDIC has a Money Smart for a variety of populations, and they worked with us to create one for older Americans. So it's an instructor guide and then a user resource guide. And it's, wherever people gather, where older people gather, community centers, we've had it offered in churches. We do the training through either online or other types of ways to say, we'll train the instructors, and then those instructors can go around and implement the Money Smart program. And it's a fraud prevention. What are the red flags? What are the signs to look for? What are the steps to take if you think it's going on, if it has happened? So it's just been updated. It's offered in Spanish, so it's quite a powerful program. Next slide. Another resource that we think financial institutions might get great value of, and again, all of these things that I'm referencing here are free to users, free to download, free to order, and we'll ship them to you. The issue of fiduciary status, managing someone else's money is the broad term. You suddenly get a call one night. You're responsible for mom's money. You've been the power of attorney. You might kind of know what that meant. You say, yeah, sure, Mom, I'll do that. I'm your power of attorney. But now you really are. Now you have to do some things. Well, what's my responsibilities? So we've created guides for the more formal relationships that exist. You're a fiduciary for your power of attorney. You're a Social Security payee, a Veterans Benefit payee. We have 4 different guides. And they actually come in, a few of them are state-by-state guides. Tennessee is not one of them, but the issues within it sometimes will vary by state. So our guides are national. The 4 guides are just national guides. But there can be some opportunity to make them a little bit editable for a state-by-state basis. Again, we produce these. Happy to ship them out in great numbers. Financial institutions or any organization that thinks that this would be a valuable resource for people. Also this year, we're going to be looking at creating guides for the more informal relationships that exist. You may be mom's power of attorney, but you have to manage the checkbook, and you're not good at doing that yourself. Or you're not good at suddenly mom's got the IRAs that I'm responsible for, and I don't know anything about an IRA or investing. So you may not really have some of those formal status that you might have, but it's the more informal roles. We're going to be producing similar guides for that. The next slide. So I wanted to make sure that financial institutions also saw, we've obviously done these guides and recommendations, and our regulatory authority is over, depository institutions, credit unions, those kinds of things. But there are a lot of other resources, from a lot of other regulators who can help financial institutions in working with their older clients. NASA, if you're not familiar with those, are state securities administrators. So each state has a securities regulator in addition to the national SEC. They've created guides and done some research around good practices that broker-dealers have instituted to work with their older clients, both to protect them and then to just make sure that the operations are good. But there may be great information out of that. There may be some insights that they have. Certainly a financial institution at a bank may very well have a securities arm within their branch or within their operations, so that could be very helpful. FINRA and the SEC are the national regulators for investments and securities, those kinds of things. And they have a whole effort around senior investors. So those are two great resources as well for financial institutions to, if it's not specific to your product offering and the services you offer, I think they could also be very useful in just understanding the overall issue. The last one I'll point out is the National Center on Elder Abuse. It's from the Administration on Community Living, and they have guides around those networks that I was talking about. The setting up those networks, they have some information around how to the local protection networks. If you could move on to the next slide. And this is just, I read through it, and maybe it's because I'm from UT and so smart, that I found a GAO report interesting, or it could be that that's my job and I needed to do it. This GAO report, the Government Accountability Office, put out a report in 2012 to talk about the issue of elder financial justice. And within that are, again, some things that they laid out for financial institutions that they thought would be very valuable and saw them as such great partners in being on the front lines. So that's, and then again, I've put on all the underscores or on the links to that resource. So if you can move on to the next slide. So that's my contact information. We, in the Office of Older Americans, there's about 12 of us in our office in CFPB working on these issues of to prevent elder financial exploitation. And I would say utilize us as a resource. If you've never been to our website, certainly check it out and contact us. We are, I think, an amazing resource to have devoted in the federal government to have 12 people working on these issues, whether it be from specific financial products. We just released some things on reverse mortgage. We're doing research around particular products and usage, putting out guides and information. And the more we hear from those in the field working on these things, then we know what resources we need to put together to help you. So certainly contact us. We have an email list that you can get on that just anytime we have new information coming out. I saw somewhere that somebody had, they do meal service. We put out placemats that have anti-fraud messages on the placemats, and we produce them in bulk. And they have game now. We put them out in game format. So there's a variety of things that we're doing to try to engage both the individual user and then also the intermediaries that exist that we can help. And so I don't know if I have time for a question. I have a few minutes. Okay.
So
I'm sorry to say that I wouldn't be able to answer that fully in the answer you deserve, as far as it's going to be depending upon what you're asking and then what information that's going to be in SARS. And I know that within SARS you have to have special access. You have to be able to get into it. And within the information that the bank, I'm from the education side, so I don't know the rules completely deeply enough to tell you what the bank, what the financial institution can provide or what's not.
And I apologize. First,
Sure, thank you. Part of it, I think, too, is it depends on the state where we live, but I also know for a fact, because someone on my conference planning committee works for a financial institution, and she has talked frequently about what that particular financial institution has in place, because there are some things that they can do, and they are doing, to help combat this huge problem. And it's just a matter of other banks, of other financial institutions getting on board and doing the same thing. And if that person from my planning committee, whose first name is Kim, is in the room, if she would like to say something on that, that'd be terrific.
I don't. So while Kim makes her way up, certainly I think financial institutions at times take an abundance of caution. So they may have it in one state or in one instance, they're following the rule there. So they might follow the rule very broadly because it's easier to do then. And there may be hesitation based upon like the privacy concerns. And again, so I think some of the things that we're trying to do is say, well, here are those privacy concerns that you would be able to share the information.
Okay, I'm going to take some of the heat off of Michael up here. Nothing like putting the regulator on the spot, so I'll do that. But so no, as a financial institution, I know that we're all concerned that we're following the appropriate rules and regulations when we're releasing non-public private information. So if you're in a financial institution, you know what I'm referring to. But the privacy regulation, Graham-Leach-Bliley, that you referred to, does have an exception for fraud. And it says you can release non-public private information in the case of known or suspected fraud. And I think that's kind of what the question goes to is, are there exceptions to the rule for law enforcement and for adult protective services to get access to information in a potential case of elder financial exploitation? And a lot of the time, the obstacle is the financial institution has reached out and provided information to law enforcement or adult protective services, but then when they come back to investigate, we're a little bit leery of releasing too much information. So I can't speak for all financial institutions because each attorney and their legal counsel is going to provide different information. But in general, the privacy laws and the regulation is pretty clear about that we do have the ability to release that in the case of fraud.
And I can also tell you a story. When my grandfather, the one from Hogtown, was being abused, the teller at the bank he had gone to for probably 40 years called my aunt and said, "Don't you dare tell anybody I'm telling you this, but if anybody comes in here with him, I'm calling you to tell you need to get down to the bank." So that's sort of the level I think at which financial institutions want to help protect people that they have, it's their accounts, their money, and then they develop their relationships with.
Any other
Thank you.
questions?